When people hear the phrase, the Dark Ages, they usually imagine Europe. Cold stone castles, fading roads, a world struggling to hold itself together. But while Europe fought to survive, something far darker was unfolding far to the south. Along the coasts and interior of East Africa, in lands that are now Tanzania, Kenya, and Mozambique, thriving communities lived ordered, stable lives. They farmed, they fished, they traded. They built settlements that had endured for generations. Spiritual traditions shaped daily life. Families were organized into clans. Social roles were clear. The world made sense. These people would later be known as the Zanj. They were not born into chains. They were pulled into them. Foreign traders and slavers began targeting their lands, drawn by the strength, resilience, and labor of societies they no longer saw as cultures, but as opportunity. What followed would carry thousands of men and women from their homes, across deserts, across seas, into a system designed to break them. And in the marshes of southern Iraq, that system would ignite one of the largest slave revolts in human history. By the 7th and 8th centuries, the Islamic world was rapidly expanding across the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East. Alongside this expansion came a growing demand for labor, especially in agriculture, construction, and salt mining. East African communities, close to the Arabian coast and with thriving trade networks, became prime targets. Arab Muslim traders established routes to bring captives from inland regions to coastal ports. From there, they were shipped to plantations and salt marshes across the Islamic world. For the East Africans, this was devastating. Families were torn apart and generations uprooted. The system grew organized and profitable, funneling large numbers of enslaved people to the salt mines of southern Iraq. These enslaved Africans, later known as the Zanj, were valued for their endurance and ability to work under the harshest conditions. They fueled both the economy and the ambitions of powerful rulers. The Zanj were not sent to households or skilled trades. They were sent to die slowly. In the salt marshes of southern Iraq, near Basra, enslaved Africans were forced into brutal labor. Extracting salt from swampy, poisoned, the work was relentless. Digging, hauling, draining under a burning sun, surrounded by insects, disease, and stagnant water. Many did not survive long. These labor camps were among the harshest in the medieval world. Food was scarce, shelter minimal, and punishment constant. The enslaved worked in large gangs, stripped of identity and hope, treated as expendable tools rather than human beings. For years, sometimes decades, this system continued, enriching landowners while consuming thousands of lives. Revolts do not begin with armies. They begin with despair. In the salt marshes of southern Iraq, suffering was constant and inescapable. The Zanj labored together under brutal conditions, working until exhaustion, punished without mercy, replaced without hesitation. Death was common. Hope was not. Yet despair can bind people together. Shared suffering created shared understanding. The enslaved knew the system was cruel, but they also saw it was careless. Local landowners ruled with corruption, while the Abbasid state remained distant, distracted by rebellion elsewhere. Promises of better treatment were made and broken. Escape was met with violence. Slowly, the Zanj learned their masters relied on fear more than strength. Stories of lost homelands, broken families, and stolen lives passed from worker to worker. These were not yet plans for rebellion, but the belief that nothing could be worse than the present was already taking hold. All that remained was a catalyst. Into this world of exhaustion and abandonment stepped a man named Ali ibn Muhammad. His origins are debated even by medieval sources. Some claim Arab descent, others Persian, and some suggest African ancestry. What is certain is he was educated, articulate, and deeply familiar with Islamic theology and social grievances within the Abbasid world. Ali ibn Muhammad did not arrive as a slave, but as an outsider who understood the language of revolt. He had failed at previous uprisings elsewhere, learning firsthand how rebellion could collapse without organization, discipline, and belief. By the time he reached southern Iraq, he recognized what others had not. The Zanj were not merely oppressed, they were concentrated, numerous, and forgotten. He spoke to them not as property, but as people wronged by a corrupt order. He promised freedom, wealth taken from their masters, and a reversal of the hierarchy that had crushed them. To the enslaved, his words did not sound radical, they sounded reasonable. For the first time, despair began to take the shape of direction. Ali ibn Muhammad did not preach rebellion alone. He wrapped it in belief. Drawing from Islamic language familiar across the Abbasid world, he framed the revolt as moral correction rather than chaos. He spoke of justice denied, of rulers who had abandoned righteousness, and of an order corrupt through greed and cruelty. To the Zanj, he promised more than freedom. He promised status. Those who followed him would no longer labor in salt marshes, but would rule them. Wealth taken from plantation owners would be redistributed. Former slaves would become soldiers, commanders, and governors in a new order built from the ruins of the old. Religion gave his movement legitimacy. Material reward gave it urgency. Whether Ali truly believed his own claims mattered little. What mattered was that his message fused faith, vengeance, and survival into a single cause. For men and women who had nothing left to lose, the revolt became not just possible, but righteous. By the late 8th century, the Abbasid Caliphate stretched across vast lands, from Persia to North Africa. Governing such an immense territory was a constant challenge. Local governors held authority in name, but often lacked resources, loyalty, or both. Corruption ran deep, and many officials were more interested in wealth than justice. The Zanj, laboring in marshes along the lower Tigris and Euphrates, were far from centers of power. Complaints, petitions, or escapes rarely reached Baghdad in time to provoke action. And when they did, officials often dismissed them, viewing the suffering of black slaves as insignificant. This combination of distance, neglect, and bureaucratic inefficiency allowed Ali ibn Muhammad's message to spread largely unchecked. What the empire considered minor unrest would soon erupt into the largest slave uprising the world had ever witnessed. By the early 9th century, frustration among the Zanj had reached a breaking point. Daily, back-breaking labor in the salt marshes, brutal overseers, and the ever-present threat of death had sown despair. Small acts of defiance, tools hidden, work slowed, whispered plans of escape began to ripple through the camps. Ali ibn Muhammad, articulate and magnetic, recognized this simmering unrest. He moved among the enslaved, spreading his message of justice, hope, and liberation. What had begun as isolated acts of resistance was now coalescing into a shared purpose. The Zanj, once voiceless and scattered, were discovering the power of unity, and the stage was set. A widespread revolt was no longer a distant dream. It was fast becoming a looming reality. By the mid-9th century, Ali ibn Muhammad had transformed scattered acts of defiance into coordinated action. Small bands of Zanj struck isolated outposts and supply lines, testing local forces. These early skirmishes were brief but remarkably effective, driven by desperation and intimate knowledge of the marshlands. The rebels developed rudimentary strategies, exploiting hidden channels, dense reeds, and treacherous mudflats that Abbasid troops could not navigate. News of these victories spread quickly, drawing more disaffected laborers, peasants, and escaped slaves into the fold. What had begun as isolated pockets of unrest was now shaping into a growing, disciplined movement. The Abbasid authorities, initially dismissive, began to sense this was no ordinary disturbance. The rebellion had teeth, and the empire was facing a threat unlike any it had seen before. By this stage, Ali ibn Muhammad's leadership had begun to solidify. The scattered groups of Zanj, once acting independently, were brought under a central command. Scouts, raiders, and messengers became the backbone of a more disciplined and coordinated movement. The marshes of southern Iraq served as a natural fortress, a base from which raids could be launched and retreats made with minimal risk. Sympathetic villages provided food, intelligence, and recruits, strengthening the rebels' hold on the region. Ali emphasized both religious and social rhetoric, portraying the revolt as more than a fight for freedom. It was a moral challenge to the injustice of the Abbasid system. This message united slaves, peasants, and disenfranchised laborers under a single purpose, giving the rebellion a cohesion the empire had sorely underestimated. As the rebellion gathered strength, the Zanj moved beyond survival and into open warfare. What began as isolated attacks evolved into coordinated raids on plantations, estates, and garrison towns across southern Iraq. Slave camps were overrun, chains shattered, and new fighters absorbed into a rapidly expanding force. Abbasid supply lines were struck first. Grain stores burned, canals sabotaged, and roads rendered impassable. These attacks weakened local authorities and disrupted the economy built on forced labor. Each successful raid emboldened the rebels and spread fear among landowners and officials alike. For the first time, the Abbasid state was forced to recognize the uprising as more than a local disturbance. Reports reaching Baghdad spoke of organized armies of former slaves moving with discipline and intent. The empire now faced an enemy it had helped create, and one no longer willing to remain unseen. Alarmed by the scale of the uprising, the Abbasid Caliphate finally moved to crush it by force. Troops were dispatched from Baghdad and neighboring provinces, led by generals confident a band of former slaves could be defeated quickly. They were wrong. In the marshlands of southern Iraq, imperial armies found themselves at a severe disadvantage. Heavy cavalry and rigid formations proved useless in flooded terrain, narrow canals, and dense reeds. The Zanj knew the land. They struck swiftly, then vanished back into the wetlands before retaliation could follow. Worse still, many Abbasid soldiers were unpaid, poorly motivated, and unfamiliar with the region. Some deserted. Others marched straight into ambushes that wiped out entire units. Each defeat emboldened the rebels, and expose the empire's weakness. What was meant to be a swift suppression became a prolonged war, one that would drain the Abbasid treasury and stain its authority for years to come. At the height of the rebellion, the Zanj created something unprecedented: their own capital city. Deep within the marshes, they built Al-Mukhtara, the Chosen, a fortified stronghold concealed by waterways, reeds, and mudflats that imperial armies struggled to penetrate. This was no temporary encampment. Al-Mukhtara functioned as a true rebel state, complete with leadership, supply lines, fortifications, and a clear chain of command. From within its defenses, Ali ibn Muhammad ruled as more than a rebel leader, issuing orders, distributing spoils, and presenting himself as a legitimate ruler in open defiance of the Abbasid Caliph. From Al-Mukhtara, the Zanj launched coordinated campaigns across southern Iraq. Towns were captured, weapons seized, and trade routes linking Basra to the wider empire disrupted. Abbasid authority collapsed across entire regions, not because of foreign invasion, but because of an uprising born from exploitation. For the first time, the Caliphate faced a terrifying reality. This was no longer a slave revolt, it was a rival power. As the conflict dragged on, the Zanj Revolt entered a darker phase. What had begun as resistance hardened into total war. Cities changed hands, and with each victory came retribution. Abbasid officials, landowners, and soldiers were killed, sometimes publicly, to signal that the old order was finished. The empire answered in kind. Captured rebels were executed. Villages suspected of aiding the Zanj were burned. The marshlands became killing fields, where loyalty was demanded and mercy was rare. Abbasid chroniclers later described the revolt as savage and lawless, but those same accounts rarely dwelled on the conditions that had created it: the starvation, the beatings, the slow deaths in the salt flats. The violence shocked the empire, not because it was new, but because it was finally directed upward. By this point, reconciliation was impossible. Neither side was fighting to negotiate, both were fighting to destroy. As the conflict dragged on, the Zanj Revolt entered a darker phase. What had begun as resistance hardened into total war. Cities changed hands, and with each victory came retribution. Abbasid officials, landowners, and soldiers were killed, sometimes publicly, to signal that the old order was finished. The empire answered in kind. Captured rebels were executed. Villages suspected of aiding the Zanj were burned. The marshlands became killing fields, where loyalty was demanded and mercy was rare. Abbasid chroniclers later described the revolt as savage and lawless, but those same accounts rarely dwelled on the conditions that had created it: the starvation, the beatings, the slow deaths in the salt flats. The violence shocked the empire, not because it was new, but because it was finally directed upward. By this point, reconciliation was impossible. Neither side was fighting to negotiate, both were fighting to destroy. As the conflict dragged on, the Zanj Revolt entered a darker phase. What had begun as resistance hardened into total war. Cities changed hands, and with each victory came retribution. Abbasid officials, landowners, and soldiers were killed, sometimes publicly, to signal that the old order was finished. The empire answered in kind. Captured rebels were executed. Villages suspected of aiding the Zanj were burned. The marshlands became killing fields, where loyalty was demanded and mercy was rare. Abbasid chroniclers later described the revolt as savage and lawless, but those same accounts rarely dwelled on the conditions that had created it: the starvation, the beatings, the slow deaths in the salt flats. The violence shocked the empire not because it was new, but because it was finally directed upward. By this point, reconciliation was impossible. Neither side was fighting to negotiate, both were fighting to destroy. By this stage, the Zanj Revolt had grown far beyond a simple labor uprising. Ali ibn Muhammad and his lieutenants established fortified encampments along the lower Tigris and Euphrates, turning the marshes into natural strongholds. Trenches were dug, watchtowers built, and winding waterways used as defensive channels, making direct attacks by Abbasid forces perilous. News of Zanj victories spread quickly, inspiring enslaved communities across southern Iraq to join the cause. Farmers, artisans, and laborers fled oppressive conditions to swell the rebel ranks. The uprising was no longer a local disturbance. It had transformed into a full-scale rebellion, directly challenging Abbasid authority in the region. The imperial response grew increasingly desperate. Commanders sent to suppress the revolt faced not only the Zanj, but the treacherous terrain, disease, and ambushes exploiting the rebels' intimate knowledge of the marshes. Each failed campaign only strengthened Ali ibn Muhammad's reputation as a cunning and relentless strategist. By 869 AD, the Zanj rebels had demonstrated remarkable military skill. Using intimate knowledge of the marshes, they set ambushes along narrow waterways, cutting off Abbasid supply lines and isolating garrisons. Small detachments struck swiftly, retreating into swamps before the heavily armored imperial forces could respond. Several major engagements showcased the revolt's growing strength. Abbasid armies, often underestimating the rebels, suffered crushing defeats. Fortified cities and outposts intended to suppress the uprising were overrun or forced into uneasy truces. The Zanj's combination of guerrilla tactics, strategic fortifications, and high morale made them nearly unstoppable in their territory. These victories spread fear across southern Iraq. Merchants, governors, and commanders began to doubt Baghdad's control. Meanwhile, Ali ibn Muhammad's charisma and vision, both spiritual and social, drew new followers, swelling the rebellion's ranks and cementing its place as a force the empire could no longer ignore. By 869 AD, the Zanj rebels had demonstrated remarkable military skill. Using intimate knowledge of the marshes, they set ambushes along narrow waterways, cutting off Abbasid supply lines and isolating garrisons. Small detachments struck swiftly, retreating into swamps before the heavily armored imperial forces could respond. Several major engagements showcased the revolt's growing strength. Abbasid armies, often underestimating the rebels, suffered crushing defeats. Fortified cities and outposts intended to suppress the uprising were overrun or forced into uneasy truces. The Zanj's combination of guerrilla tactics, strategic fortifications, and high morale made them nearly unstoppable in their territory. These victories spread fear across southern Iraq. Merchants, governors, and commanders began to doubt Baghdad's control. Meanwhile, Ali ibn Muhammad's charisma and vision, both spiritual and social, drew new followers, swelling the rebellion's ranks and cementing its place as a force the empire could no longer ignore. After nearly 15 years of relentless fighting, Abbasid forces finally regained the upper hand. Using overwhelming numbers, fortified positions, and coordinated assaults, they systematically dismantled rebel strongholds. Ali ibn Muhammad was captured and executed, and his lieutenants were either killed or scattered. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of Zanj slaves, rebels, and civilians perished. Fields lay abandoned, cities depopulated, and the economic toll of the uprising lingered for decades. Though the revolt failed to overthrow the Abbasid Caliphate, it left a lasting mark. It exposed the fragility of imperial control over distant provinces and demonstrated the capacity for organized resistance among enslaved populations. The Zanj Revolt remains one of the largest and most brutal slave uprisings in world history, a testament to the courage, resilience, and desperation of those who rose against oppression.